sometimes you need to work with images that are specific to each platform, like the icons on buttons and toolbars, because each of these platforms have their own design guideline. So if you want to give your application the native look and feel for each platform, you want to use platform-specific images. Now in this video, I'm going to show you how to add an icon to a button. I've got this icon from a very cool website called icons8.com. On this website, you can find lots of free icons for all different kinds of platforms. You can customize them, you can get them in different sizes and different colors, and they're all free. So I highly recommend you to try this website. Now, I've attached a zip file to this lecture, and inside this zip file, you're going to find 3 folders: iOS, Android, and Windows. In the iOS folder, you're going to find 3 files: clock.png, clock at 2x.png, and clock at 3x.png. Now, both iOS and Android are capable of loading different image resolutions based on the target device. So you probably know that newer phones have more pixel density, which means you can display higher quality images. That's why inside the iOS folder, we have this clock icon at different resolutions. Now, what I want you to note here is the naming convention for iOS. So our original clock file is 32 by 32 pixels. Now we have another clock file with the suffix at 2x, which is twice as big as the original clock file. And similarly, we have another file with the suffix at 3x. So whenever you want to supply platform-specific images for iOS, it's best to supply the same image in 3 different sizes. In Android, we have a different convention. So we have different folder names. And all these folders start with drawable dash. So here, HDPI stands for high DPI, XH stands for extra high, and XXH stands for extra high. Now with Windows, I personally am a little bit confused because the documentation is inconsistent. Some documents claim that with Windows you can supply images with different dimensions, but other documents deny that. So honestly, I have no experience in that area, and that's why we have only one file inside the Windows folder. Now, one thing you need to know about Android is that the name of your file should only contain lowercase letters, numbers, underscore, and period. All right, now let me show you how to use these icons in our application. So in Xamarin Studio or Visual Studio, inside the iOS project, you see a folder called Resources. We put all our images here. So add files. Here we have 3 files. So I'm going to add all of them together. Now with Android, again, we have a folder called Resources. And inside this folder, you see subfolders that all start with drawable. So let me show you one example, and then I'm going to pause the recording because the steps are exactly the same. So with drawable, I'm going to add a file. Inside our Android folder, we've got drawable and clock.png. So in Android, the file name is exactly the same, but it's in different folders. Now, I want you to repeat this step with other subfolders here. With Windows projects, you need to put the file in the root of the project. But because I'm using Xamarin Studio on Mac here, I don't have a Windows project. So I leave it to you as an exercise. All right, now that we have included our image in different application projects, we can add a button here and set its image to the name of our image file. In this case, clock.png. Now let's take a look at the result. All right, here's our icon. Let me zoom in so you can see more clearly. That's better. Now, if you happen to have a lot of images in your app, you may want to organize them into different folders. Especially on Windows, I told you that by default, you need to put these images in the root folder. And that's kind of messy. I don't know why Windows developers decided to assume that by default, these images should be in the root folder. So let me show you how we can override this convention. First of all, I'm going to assign this button an X name. Let's call it btn. Now I'm going to go in the code behind btn.image. Now look at the type of this property. It's file image source. So it's one of the derivatives of image source class that you have seen earlier. If you want to create a file image source, you would use image source dot from file. That's another static factory method on the image source class. And here we add the file name, clock.png. Now we have a red underline here because this method returns an image source. So we need to explicitly cast it to file image source. File image source. All right, now let's say in our Windows project, we want to put this file in a subfolder called images. How do we do that? Remember device.onPlatform? We use this method to deal with device differences. So in this case, I want to supply a different file name or path depending on the target platform. So we can use device.onPlatform. Now for iOS, I'm going to use clock.png. For Android, again, I'm going to use clock.png. And for WinPhone, I'm going to use images/clock.png. Now in this case, I'm overwriting the path in the Windows project, but you can use the same technique to overwrite the file name or its path in iOS or Android project as well. We can also use the same technique in XAML. So back in our XAML file, we want to supply different images for different platforms. So I'm going to delete this attribute. Use property element syntax, so button.image. And here use onPlatform. We set type arguments. Now because image here is not really a string, it's actually a file image source. So type arguments should be file image source. Now for different platforms, we supply different values. So iOS, we set this to a string. And there is actually an implicit conversion from a string to a file image source. That's why earlier we simply set the image here to a string. Okay, now let's get back to our onPlatform element. So Android, again clock.png, and for WinPhone, we can use images/clock.png. Now, before we finish this lecture, I want to clarify something. Earlier, I told you that there is an implicit conversion from a string to a URI image source. And in this lecture, I told you that there is also an implicit conversion from a string to a file image source. So how does that work? How does Xamarin Forms know how to parse a string? Well, if that string starts with HTTP, it will parse it into a URI image source. Otherwise, it's going to be a file image source, which means a local file in each application project.